Hello, everyone. My name is Eun-Hae Kim. I am a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. I'm really excited to share my work with you today at the BES, and I hope you also find this presentation valuable. To give you a little bit of background about my research, I'm really interested in bringing ecological approaches into urban green space design since I came from landscape architecture. However, I've encountered some interesting challenges when attempting to integrate ecological concepts into practice. Well, ecology primarily deals with natural habitats. And of course, urban areas are also considered habitats as part of this whole Earth ecosystem, which is subject to the same ecological principles. Yet we often find some unique complexities in urban space. For example, let's look into these ecological niche models. This is one of the most favored modelings in the fields of ecology, especially in the context of climate change. The niche modelings are useful in predicting any potential shifts in species distributions or assessing habitat suitability. For urban environments where human decision impacts in species composition rather than natural selections, niche models can be used to support planning decisions, for instance, in selecting suitable tree species for future climates. However, when it comes to running the model, it is not straightforward as it is in natural habitats. The model requires two building blocks of information: occurrences and n-dimensional environmental variables. In natural habitats, presence of certain species proves successful establishment through reproduction and dispersal. And it also means it's successfully adapted to the given environmental conditions. On the contrast, in urban areas, successful establishment of species does not necessarily mean the same context. And especially when certain introduced species are found beyond the known native range or niche breadth, it could give a quite contrasting perspective. In one study, it says that niche breadth of urban species were extended, therefore the area of realized niche has increased. In another study, it says that more than half of those urban species are out of their safety margins. Therefore, they are at high risk. Now, which one is more accurately describing the reality? So my research question naturally comes to, what does urban presence really mean, especially when the species are located beyond the niche breadth or beyond their known tolerance limits? Does that mean realization of potential niche that was once impossible to access before due to geographical barriers? Or are we unnaturally keeping those species in unsuitable habitats for the purpose of human self-interests? To test out this idea, the analysis of mortality rates using urban inventory data were considered. 3 urban botanic gardens in the UK were selected to collect their inventory data. There were 2 criteria for these selections. First, inventory size. It has to be large enough in terms of accumulated period, number of species, and number of individuals per species, etc. Second is that each garden should represent different climatic gradients. Kew, located in southeast UK region, a relatively warmer and drier summer. Westonbirt, the National Arboretum, located in southwest UK, where it is warm but more moist, about 40% more annual precipitation compared to Kew. Lastly, Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, located in northern UK region, where it is cooler and its moist level is just between Kew and Westonbirt. From the inventory database, all the mortality records between the year 2000 and 2021 and the current living collections as of the year end of 2021 were extracted. 4 drought-related variables were selected because it was hypothesized that if those species below their tolerance limits are truly vulnerable, they would show higher mortality rates when exposed to climate stress. They are mean annual precipitation during the warmest quarter, climate moisture index, and potential evapotranspiration index. Given these selected variables, mortality rates were compared against their niche positions, whether the mortality response was higher when it is positioned below 5th percentile of their niche breadth. For the experiment, 2 genera, Acer and Quercus, were selected. They were selected because they often co-occur in natural distributions and exhibit differentiating characteristics. For instance, Quercus is known as canopy species and Acer as sub-canopy species. It would be interesting to compare these 2 species in response. The tests were carried out at both genus level and species level. For annual mortality response, it had to be genus level. It means all individuals within the genus were aggregated. This is because to calculate mortality rates, it has to have some minimum number of individuals per species, and not all species had enough specimen to calculate annual mortality rates. For a species level test, the cumulative mortality rates over a 21-year period for each species were calculated by selecting those species with a minimum of 6 specimens. Here, this page is a summary of results for annual mortality response by genus. First, 2 graphs on top illustrate the drought index, SPEI, from year 2000 to 2021. SPEI is a monthly standardized water balance of total precipitation subtracted by the total evapotranspiration. First graphic is showing growing season trend. The second is showing a trend for cumulative index in previous 5 years. And the third graph is the trend for total number of heat wave days. As you can see, while SPI growing season fluctuates every year, SPI 5-year shows significant decreasing trend in regression line for both Kew and Westonbirt. And particularly in Kew, the number of heat wave days continued and exacerbated every year since 2011. The last graph at the bottom shows the annual mortality trends from logistic regression. You can see that the annual trend for Acer in green line is above the Quercus in red line, which means higher mortality for Acer than Quercus. In general, both Acer and Quercus are drawing relatively flat lines, almost in parallel with each other, but towards the end, you will see uprising trend in Acer, especially at Kew. In Westonbirt, there was one period where mortality of Quercus exceeded Acer, but generally it is showing similar pattern with Kew. The vertical red dotted lines indicate those years when both Acer and Quercus showed outstanding increase in mortality compared to the average. What is interesting here is that this outstanding increase usually occurs a year after the overlap period of lowest point of SPEI 5-year and a negative SPI growing season. Here we have to acknowledge that trees usually do not immediately respond to drought, but start to reduce its growth in the following year and slowly recover. The whole recovery process takes at least several years or longer. And usually, SPEI 5-year reaches its lowest point after 4 or 5 years from the intense drought event. What seems to happen during this overlap period is that the tree tried to recover from cumulative drought stress, but ended up encountering a new growing season drought. This repeated drought events at the weakened state is more likely to be more damaging to trees, which causes a failure. Here in this page, Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, is also showing the similar pattern with Kew and Westonbirt. Higher mortality response curve for Acer and rising mortality response towards the end of the study period. But unlike Kew and Westonbirt, heat stress is not visible in Edinburgh. But the intensity of cumulative drought level in year 2018 was severest among the 3 botanic gardens. This page is a summary of overall cumulative mortality for Acer species by niche positions of 4 selected climate variables. The gray bars indicate those species positioning below the lower 5th percentile niche breadth, or simply below the lower threshold. The white bars are those within the known tolerance limits. As you can see in each chart from A to D, the median of gray bars are slightly higher, but among the 4 variables, only PWQ, precipitation during the warmest quarter, showed the statistical significance. One of the reasons why is that many of the Acer species came from temperate Southeast or East Asia, where it is influenced by monsoonal climate. In these regions, about 60% or more of annual rainfalls are concentrated in the summer seasons, and the mean annual precipitation are normally twice or more than that of the UK. So there is a huge seasonal differences. Another interesting finding is that the single climatic variable has very weak effects in mortality response. The mean mortality response was doubled compared to the overall average when its niche position was below all 3 variables, MAT, PWQ, and CMI. The variable PET is a little different from the other 3 variables because positioning below the minimum threshold of PET indicates that the species originated from the environment with warmer and higher demands in evapotranspiration. So this outposition in PET means that it is more advantageous in heat and drought stress. Quercus species were a little different from Acer species. As you can see, there is no clear difference between white bars and gray bars. And of course, mean mortality rate was much lower, 0.14, which is about 50% lower than that of Acer. So Quercus species in general showed more resilience than Acer species when exposed to the same level of climate stress. If you're interested in more detailed analysis and species-specific mortality rate data, you can check it online here. It is published and available online in the Science of the Total Environment journal. Lastly, I would like to summarize my work and raise some open questions here. Urban species so far did not get much attention from the ecologist community. It has been a bit out of scope. However, being out of scope or being out of its natural habitats can be the very reason why it needs more attention, because it could offer an excellent opportunity to test its true physiological limits under stress. Going back to the question I raised in the beginning, urban occurrences could be somewhere between the extended realized niche and increased risks. And it relies on specific species-specific or individual specific differences. Although I introduced some of the general tendency in observed mortality response between Acer and Quercus, there are also exceptional cases as well. For instance, the certain species like Acer pictum from East Asia shows very high resilience, even if it is below the tolerance threshold of all 3 variables. There might be some critical opinions regarding irrigations or human interventions in urban gardens, which I discussed in more detail in my paper. But basically, human interventions might help a little, but cannot win the external environment unless urban trees are raised in totally controlled environment like greenhouse. And vulnerable species would eventually fail. And failure of trees occur over multiple time scales and triggered by repeated but short duration events of extreme weathers. And these factors can be easily hidden in a broad scale of climatic variables, which are often used for niche modelings. Basically, urban species are more accessible for monitoring. If we can improve the way we build this inventory data, I believe we may be benefited from using urban inventory data as a valuable input to improve niche models. Thank you.